The cold sting of late autumn air bit at Sadie Armstrong's cheeks as she stood rigid on Whiteridge's dusty Main Street. The year was 1875, and the Montana Territory was still wild, untamed, and unforgiving, much like the crowd gathering around her. 6 pairs of eyes burned into her face, but Sadie kept her gaze fixed on the weathered wooden planks beneath her feet. "Cat got your tongue again, girl." Josiah Miller's voice carried across the growing crowd, his words slicing through the morning air. The storekeeper's son leaned against a hitching post, a smug expression darkening his features. "Been here 3 weeks and not a single word. Starting to think you ain't right in the head." Sadie's fingers tightened around her woven basket. Inside lay carefully folded linens she'd spent hours washing for Mrs. Holloway. The coins she'd earn would buy flour and beans to last another week if she could make it to the general store without this confrontation turning ugly. "Maybe she thinks she's too good for the likes of us," called Eliza Patterson, the banker's daughter whose golden curls and fine dresses couldn't mask the meanness in her eyes. "That's why she won't speak to nobody proper." Heat crept up Sadie's neck as the whispers spread. She'd hoped the novelty of mocking the mute laundress would have worn off by now. 3 weeks since arriving in Whiteridge, fleeing memories too painful to voice, and still they circled her like vultures awaiting a final breath. "Let's see if we can make her squawk," said Josiah, taking a step toward her. Sadie took a reflexive step back, her heart hammering against her ribs. The crowd had grown to nearly a dozen onlookers, most just watching with detached curiosity, a few with poorly concealed amusement. Enough. The single word cut through the tension like a knife. The crowd parted, and Sadie glimpsed the source of the command. A tall man stood in the gap, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the morning sun. Colton Wade, the local rancher whose reputation preceded him across 3 counties. His dark hat was pulled low, but Sadie could feel his eyes assessing the situation from beneath its brim. "Don't you have somewhere to be, Josiah?" Colton's voice was deceptively casual, but there was steel beneath the words. "Just having a bit of fun, Wade," Josiah replied, though he'd already taken 2 steps back. Colton stepped fully into the circle now, positioning himself between Sadie and her tormentors. "Her silence speaks louder than any of you," he said, his words measured but carrying clearly across the dusty street. "And what it's saying right now is that you folks need better ways to spend your mornings." A nervous ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. Nobody in Whiteridge crossed Colton Wade lightly. His cattle operation employed half the men in town, and his word carried weight with the other half. "The girl's odd, Wade," Eliza said, unwilling to surrender her entertainment so easily. "Won't speak a word to anyone. It ain't natural." "Natural." Colton tilted his hat back slightly, revealing piercing blue eyes that scanned the crowd. "There's nothing natural about grown men and women surrounding one woman like this. Now disperse, before I take a personal interest in each of your affairs." The crowd melted away like snow in April sunshine. Josiah lingered longest, his gaze moving between Colton and Sadie with poorly disguised resentment before he, too, turned away when they were alone. Colton turned to face Sadie fully. She braced herself for the questions, the demands to explain her silence, the inevitable disappointment when she failed to respond. Instead, he simply nodded toward her basket. "Mrs. Holloway's place is on your way back." Sadie managed a slight nod, her eyes finally lifting to meet his. "Mind if I walk with you? I've got business in that direction." She hesitated, then nodded again, clutching her basket tighter as they fell into step together down the main street. "I don't need to know why you don't speak," Colton said after they'd walked a block in silence. "Everyone in this town has secrets. Some just hide them differently than others." Sadie stole a glance at his profile. His jaw was set, eyes forward, seemingly comfortable with her silence in a way no one else in Whiteridge had been. Something in her chest loosened slightly. "I own the Double Circle Ranch east of town," he continued conversationally. "Just so you know who's walking beside you, I'm not in the habit of escorting ladies through town, but those folks needed reminding of their manners." A small smile tugged at Sadie's lips. She couldn't remember the last time she'd smiled. "Ah, there it is," Colton said, catching her expression. "Worth the trouble already." They reached Mrs. Holloway's boarding house too quickly. Sadie paused at the whitewashed gate, unsure how to express her gratitude without words. Colton seemed to understand. "No need for thanks. This town can be hard on newcomers, but it has good people too." He touched the brim of his hat. "Miss Armstrong." As he turned to leave, Sadie impulsively reached out, her fingers brushing his sleeve. When he looked back, she met his gaze fully for the first time and nodded once, deliberately. "You're welcome," he said softly. "And if they bother you again, you come find me at the double circle. Sometimes silence needs defending." Sadie watched him walk away, his tall figure cutting a straight path down the street. For the first time since arriving in Whiteridge, she felt something beyond fear and grief, a tiny spark of something that might, with careful tending, grow into hope. 4 days passed before Sadie saw Colton Wade again. 4 days of careful navigation through town, of avoiding Josiah Miller and his friends, of keeping her head down and her basket close. Mrs. Holloway had proven to be a fair employer, paying Sadie for her laundry work with both coins and a small room at the back of the boarding house. The work was hard but honest, and it kept her hands busy while her mind wrestled with memories. On the 5th day, a Tuesday, Sadie was hanging sheets in Mrs. Holloway's back garden when the older woman bustled outside, wiping flour-covered hands on her apron. "Miss Armstrong, there's someone asking for you out front," she said, curiosity evident in her tone. In the 3 weeks since Sadie had arrived, no one had ever come calling. Sadie froze, one of Mrs. Holloway's best linens half pinned to the line. Had Josiah and his friends come to continue what Colton had interrupted, Mrs. Holloway must have read her expression. "It's Mr. Wade," she clarified. "Says he has a proposition for you. Business-like," she added with a meaningful glance. Relief washed over Sadie, followed immediately by confusion. What business could the rancher possibly have with her? She wiped her hands on her simple brown skirt and followed Mrs. Holloway through the kitchen and down the narrow hallway to the front parlor. Colton Wade stood near the window, hat in hand, looking uncomfortably large amidst Mrs. Holloway's delicate furniture and lace doilies. He turned as she entered, and Sadie was struck again by the directness of his gaze. Most people in town looked at her with curiosity, pity, or disdain. Colton simply looked at her as if she were any other person. "Miss Armstrong," he greeted her with a nod. "I hope I'm not interrupting your work." Mrs. Holloway hovered in the doorway. "I'll just put on some coffee," she said, clearly intending to hear whatever proposition was forthcoming. "No need, madam," Colton said politely but firmly. "I won't take much of Miss Armstrong's time." When Mrs. Holloway had reluctantly retreated, Colton turned back to Sadie. "My housekeeper, Mrs. Fletcher, has taken ill. Her daughter's come to fetch her back to Illinois until she recovers. Could be months." He cleared his throat. "I've a ranch house with 6 hands and no one to cook or clean. Mrs. Holloway mentioned you're good with laundry and keep a neat room." Sadie blinked, taken aback by the unexpected turn. "It would be a live-in position," Colton continued. "Private room, meals included, and twice what you're making now. I understand your situation is unusual, but the men at Double Circle are there to work cattle, not conversation." He shifted his hat in his hands. "You'd be treated with respect. You have my word on that." Sadie's mind raced. The offer was unexpectedly generous. Mrs. Holloway was fair, but the work was barely enough to sustain her with nothing left to save. And yet, to live at her ranch, isolated with men she didn't know. "You don't need to answer now," Colton said, seeming to read her hesitation. "Think on it. I'll be in town until sundown taking supplies back." He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a folded paper. "I've written down the terms, so there's no confusion." Sadie accepted the paper, their fingers brushing momentarily. His were rough and calloused, a working man's hands. If you decide yes, be at Jennings' General Store at 4 o'clock with your belongings. If not, no hard feelings." He settled his hat back on his head. "Good day, Miss Armstrong." After he left, Sadie unfolded the paper. The terms were clear and fair, written in a surprisingly neat hand. Double her current wages with room and board included. Sundays free to attend church if she wished. A quarterly review of her work with potential increases in pay. Mrs. Holloway appeared in the doorway almost immediately. "Well, what did he want?" Sadie handed her the paper, watching as the older woman's eyebrows rose progressively higher. "Heavens above," Mrs. Holloway breathed. "That's a handsome offer." She glanced at Sadie shrewdly. Though a single woman at her ranch full of men, it raises questions. Sadie frowned, taking back the paper. "Oh, not about Mr. Wade," Mrs. Holloway hastened to add. "He's as straight as they come. His father built that ranch from nothing, and Colton's doubled its size since taking over. Not a whisper of scandal about him." She lowered her voice. "Though plenty of the local girls have tried to catch his eye, man that handsome and well-established, still unmarried at 32. It's not natural." Sadie folded the paper carefully, tucking it into her pocket. "You're considering it," Mrs. Holloway said, not a question. Sadie nodded slowly. "Well, I can't say I blame you. That's good money, and Lord knows you work hard enough to earn it." She sighed. "I'd be sorry to lose you, but it would be wrong of me to stand in your way." For the next several hours, as Sadie finished the laundry and swept the boarding house porch, her mind circled the decision like a hawk eyeing prey. Whiteridge had offered her sanctuary of a sort, but not acceptance. The incident with Josiah wouldn't be the last. People grew uncomfortable with her silence, then suspicious, then hostile. At the double circle, at least, she would have distance from the town's prying eyes. And Colton Wade had already shown himself willing to defend her silence. By 3:30, Sadie had packed her few belongings into a small carpet bag. She wrote a note of thanks to Mrs. Holloway, left it with her final week's payment on the kitchen table, and slipped out the back door. Jennings' General Store sat at the far end of the main street. Sadie kept close to the buildings, avoiding the busier sections of town. The last thing she needed was another confrontation with Josiah before leaving. At precisely 4 o'clock, she rounded the corner to see a loaded wagon outside the general store. Colton was securing a crate while speaking with Mr. Jennings. He looked up as she approached, and something like approval flashed across his features. "Miss Armstrong," he greeted her, taking in the carpet bag. "You've decided, then?" Sadie nodded firmly. "Good, we'll be heading out directly." He extended a hand for her bag, which she relinquished after only a moment's hesitation. "The ranch is about an hour's ride east. Road gets a bit rough toward the end." Mr. Jennings watched their exchange with undisguised curiosity. "Taking on new help, Wade." "Miss Armstrong will be managing the house while Mrs. Fletcher's away," Colton replied evenly, stowing her bag in the wagon. "The mute girl." Jennings looked surprised. "Can she handle it?" "I expect she can handle anything she sets her mind to," Colton said, his tone closing the subject. He turned to Sadie. "Ready," she nodded, and he helped her up onto the wagon seat before climbing up beside her. With a flick of the reins, they were moving down the main street, past the curious stares of townspeople watching the silent laundress leave with the rancher. "We'll stop by the sheriff's office before heading out," Colton said as they drove. "Just so it's known officially where you've gone. Small towns talk, and I won't have your reputation questioned." Sadie glanced at him, grateful for his consideration. Sheriff Burke raised an eyebrow when they explained the arrangement, but made a note in his ledger without comment. 10 minutes later, they were on the eastern road out of town, Whiteridge falling away behind them. The landscape opened up before them, rolling hills dotted with pine and aspen, the distant mountains blue against the autumn sky. After a mile, Sadie felt something inside her begin to unwind, as if she'd been holding her breath since arriving in Whiteridge and could finally exhale. "It's about 8 miles to the ranch," Colton said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Most of it's my land, starting from that creek ahead." Sadie followed his gesture to where a narrow stream cut across the landscape. meandering through a stand of cottonwoods whose leaves had turned golden in the fall chill. Double Circle's been in my family since '52. My father came out from Pennsylvania, started with 40 acres and 10 head of cattle. There was quiet pride in his voice. Now it's 4,000 acres and nearly 800 head. The wagon rattled over a wooden bridge spanning the creek. A wooden sign posted on the other side read, "Double Circle Ranch established 1852 Wade, proprietor. You'll meet the men at supper," Colton continued. "Santiago's been with us longest, he's my foreman. Then there's brothers Levy and Jackson Harper, good with horses. Thomas is our youngest, still learning the ropes. And old Pete, he's past 60 but knows this land better than anyone." Sadie listened attentively, trying to memorize the names and details. These would be the men she'd be cooking and cleaning for in the coming months. "They're good men," Colton added, as if sensing her concerns. "Hardworking and respectful. Santiago's wife used to help in the house before they moved to their own place down valley. He won't stand for any foolishness from the others." The road began to climb, winding through stands of pine. As they crested a rise, Colton drew the wagon to a halt. There it is, Double Circle. Below them, nestled in a protected valley, sprawled the ranch. The main house was larger than Sadie had expected, 2 stories of solid timber construction with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. Behind it stood a large barn, bunkhouse, and various outbuildings. Fenced corrals contained horses, and in the distance, cattle dotted the rolling pastures. "It's a good place," Colton said simply. Looking at the peaceful valley as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across it, Sadie could only agree. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they seemed manageable in this moment, with the town and its judgments left far behind. As they drove down into the valley, Sadie noticed small details that spoke of care and attention: the neat stack of firewood along the side of the house, the recently mended fence around the kitchen garden, the clean, swept path leading to the front door. A dog came bounding out to meet them, a large black and white border collie that circled the wagon excitedly as they pulled up in front of the house. "That's Patch," Colton said, setting the brake. "Best cattle dog in the territory, though he'd rather be underfoot in the kitchen if you let him." The dog barked once in seeming agreement, tail wagging furiously. Before Colton could climb down, the front door opened and an older man stepped onto the porch. His weathered face was framed by a steel-gray beard and he walked with a slight limp. "Old Pete," Colton explained quietly to Sadie. "Keeps an eye on things around the house. Thought we'd seen the last of you today, boss," Pete called. "Santiago was about to send out a search party." "Had some extra business in town," Colton replied, jumping down from the wagon. He came around to help Sadie down, his hands strong and steady at her waist as she descended. Pete's bushy eyebrows rose at the sight of her. "Well now, who's this?" "Miss Sadie Armstrong," Colton said, retrieving her bag from the wagon. "She'll be taking over Mrs. Fletcher's duties while she's away." Pete removed his hat, revealing a nearly bald head. "Madam," he greeted her with unexpected gentleness. "Welcome to Double Circle." Sadie nodded in acknowledgement, surprised by the immediate acceptance. "Miss Armstrong doesn't speak," Colton said matter-of-factly, "but she understands everything just fine. I expect she'll be treated with the same respect you'd show any lady." "Course she will," Pete said, looking mildly offended at the suggestion otherwise. "Mrs. Fletcher left everything in good order inside. I've been keeping the fire going." "Thank you, Pete." Colton gestured for Sadie to precede him up the steps. "Let's get you settled before the men come in for supper." The interior of the ranch house was unexpectedly refined. The front door opened into a large, well-appointed sitting room with a stone fireplace, comfortable furniture, and bookshelves lining one wall. Through an archway, Sadie glimpsed a formal dining room with a table that could seat at least 12. "My mother had definite ideas about how a proper home should look," Colton explained, noticing her surprise. "She brought half of Philadelphia with her when she came west, never quite adjusted to frontier life, but she made sure we lived like civilized folks. He led her through the dining room to a spacious kitchen at the back of the house. A large cast iron stove dominated one wall, and a long wooden table filled the center of the room. Windows overlooked the kitchen garden and beyond it, the barn and corrals. Mrs. Fletcher's room is through there, Colton said, indicating a door off the kitchen. It's yours now. The men eat breakfast at 6, take lunch in the fields most days, and suppers at 7. Sundays are usually cold meals so you can have the day easier. He set her bag down. My quarters are upstairs and the office. I take breakfast early, around 5:30. Sadie nodded, taking in the information while surveying the kitchen. It was well organized, with copper pots hanging from a rack and shelves of provisions neatly labeled. I'll let you get settled, Colton said. I need to check in with Santiago about the cattle we moved yesterday. Pete can show you where everything is for supper. After he left, Pete gave her a brief tour of the kitchen's organization, pointing out where staples were stored and explaining Mrs. Fletcher's system for meal planning. She keeps a notebook there, he said, indicating a drawer beside the stove. Has all the recipes the men like best, been using it 20 years. Sadie opened the drawer to find a thick, leather-bound notebook filled with handwritten recipes and meal plans. She thumbed through it gratefully. This would make her transition much easier. Men aren't picky eaters, Pete continued. Work up too much hunger for that, but they do appreciate good bread, he smiled. If you can bake, you'll win 'em over fast. With Pete's help, Sadie prepared a straightforward first meal beef stew that Mrs. Fletcher had started that morning before leaving. Fresh bread that needed only to be warmed, and apple cobbler from the last of the stored fall harvest. By the time 7 o'clock approached, delicious aromas filled the kitchen and the table was set for 7. That's them now, Pete said, hearing voices outside. Brace yourself, Miss Armstrong, they're a rowdy bunch when they first come in. The kitchen door swung open and 4 men entered in a wave of cold air, boots stomping on the mat, voices overlapping as they discussed the day's work. They froze almost comically when they spotted Sadie standing by the stove. Well now, said the tallest of them, removing his hat. You must be Miss Armstrong. Boss told us you'd be joining us. His accent carried hints of Mexico, and his dark eyes were kind beneath salt and pepper hair. Santiago Vega, madam, foreman here at Double Circle, Sadie nodded in greeting. These hooligans are Jackson and Levy Harper, Santiago continued, indicating 2 young men with similar features, clearly brothers. And our youngest, Thomas Bennett. The men mumbled greetings, eyeing her curiously but politely. Colton entered behind them, and Sadie noticed how the others instinctively straightened in his presence. Miss Armstrong doesn't speak, Colton informed them, but she hears just fine. I expect you all to show her the same respect you showed Mrs. Fletcher. Yes, sir, they chorused, and Sadie was struck by the genuine respect in their tones. This wasn't mere deference to an employer, they genuinely respected Colton Wade. Something smells mighty fine, said the one called Levy, sniffing appreciatively. Is that Mrs. Fletcher's apple cobbler? Sadie nodded, gesturing for them to be seated. What followed was the noisiest meal Sadie had experienced in months. The men ate heartily, complimenting the food between animated discussions of cattle, horses, and weather prospects. Occasionally one would direct a question to her, is there more bread, Miss Armstrong? Or might we trouble you for more coffee? But they seemed to accept her nods and gestures without awkwardness. Colton ate more quietly, observing his men with evident satisfaction in their camaraderie. Once or twice, Sadie caught him watching her, his expression thoughtful. After the meal, when the men had helped clear the dishes, apparently a ranch tradition, and retired to the bunkhouse, Sadie found herself alone in the kitchen with Colton. You did well, he said, leaning against the doorframe. They liked you. Sadie raised an eyebrow questioningly. I can tell, he said with a small smile. They were on their best behavior. Usually there's more elbow jabbing and tall tales at supper. He straightened. Get some rest, Miss Armstrong. Morning comes early at Double Circle. With that, he bid her good night and left her to the quiet kitchen, where only the ticking of the clock and the occasional pop from the stove disturbed the silence. Sadie's room was small but comfortable, with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a small desk beneath a window that looked out toward the eastern hills. Mrs. Fletcher had left it impeccably clean, with fresh linens on the bed and a vase of dried wildflowers on the desk. As Sadie unpacked her few belongings, she realized this was the first time in over a year that she felt truly safe. The ranch was isolated, yes, but isolation meant peace. And Colton Wade had already proven himself a man who respected her silence. She slept more soundly that night than she had in months. The following weeks fell into a rhythm that Sadie found surprisingly comfortable. She rose before dawn to start breakfast, brewing strong coffee for Colton and preparing eggs, bacon, and biscuits for the men. After they departed for the day's work, she cleaned the house, prepared for the evening meal, and tended the kitchen garden, which still yielded root vegetables despite the advancing season. The men quickly adjusted to her silent presence. Santiago, with his quiet dignity, often nodded respectfully when passing her in the yard. The Harper brothers treated her with the awkward courtesy of young men around any woman, while Thomas, barely 20, sometimes forgot himself and chattered away as if expecting a response. Old Pete became something of an ally, often sitting in the kitchen while she worked, telling stories of the ranch's early days that required no reply. And then there was Colton. Unlike the others, he spoke to her not with careful simplicity but as he might to anyone else. He discussed ranch matters, commented on news from town, even occasionally asked her opinion on household decisions, always phrased so she could answer with a nod or gesture. "The cattle buyer from Chicago's coming next week," he told her one evening as she cleared the supper dishes. The others had already returned to the bunkhouse. "I'd like to serve something impressive. What do you think of roast duck? There's plenty on the north pond." Sadie considered, then shook her head, moving to the pantry to point at the last jar of preserved cherries from summer. "Ah," Colton said, understanding immediately. "Save those for something special. Good thinking." He watched as she moved efficiently around the kitchen. "You've settled in well here." Sadie paused, then nodded. It was true. The routine of the ranch suited her, and the men's acceptance of her silence had been a revelation after Whiteridge's suspicion. "I'm glad," Colton said simply. He lingered a moment longer than usual before bidding her good night. As November deepened toward December, the ranch prepared for winter. The men brought in the last hay cutting, checked fence lines that would soon be buried in snow, and moved the cattle to the sheltered southern pastures. Inside, Sadie preserved the last of the garden's bounty, filled the root cellar with potatoes and carrots, and made sure the kitchen was stocked with flour, sugar, and coffee to last through potential snowbound weeks. One evening, as the first serious snow fell outside, Colton appeared in the kitchen after supper with a large wooden crate. "Christmas decorations," he explained, setting it on the table. "My mother always insisted on making the house festive, no matter how far from civilization we were." He opened the lid to reveal carefully packed ornaments, candle holders, and lengths of evergreen garland. "I thought you might like to use them." Sadie reached into the box, lifting out a delicate glass ornament shaped like a bird. It caught the lamplight, sending prisms of color across the kitchen walls. "That was her favorite," Colton said softly. She said it reminded her of the freedom she found out here, despite everything she missed from back east. Sadie looked up at him, struck by the gentle memory in his voice. She set the ornament carefully on the table and lifted her hands, making a questioning gesture. Colton understood. "She passed 5 years ago, pneumonia after a hard winter." He touched the ornament lightly. "Haven't put these up since." Sadie considered him for a long moment, then deliberately reached for the box, pulling it closer. She looked at him with raised eyebrows, a smile tugged at his lips. "Yes, I think it's time to use them again." He paused. "Perhaps you could use some help." "The garlands go along the stair rails and mantelpiece." Together, they spent the evening transforming the ranch house. Colton hung garlands while Sadie arranged ornaments and candles. They worked in companionable silence, communicating with gestures and glances that became increasingly seamless as the night progressed. When they finished, Colton lit the candles in the sitting room, and they stood together, admiring the effect. The evergreen scent filled the air and the candlelight made the ornaments shimmer. "She would have liked this," Colton said quietly. "She would have liked you too." Sadie glanced at him, surprised by the personal comment. "She valued actions over words," he explained. Said too many people filled the air with empty talk while their hands remained idle. Sadie smiled at that, recognizing something of herself in the description. "I should let you get some rest," Colton said, though he made no move to leave. "Thank you for doing this. It feels like Christmas again." Impulsively, Sadie reached out and squeezed his hand. His fingers closed briefly around hers, warm and strong, before she withdrew. "Good night, Sadie," he said, using her first name for the first time. After he went upstairs, Sadie remained in the sitting room, watching the candles burn low. Something was changing between them, something neither had put into words, yet both seemed to recognize. In the flickering light, surrounded by decorations from his past that now connected to her present, Sadie allowed herself to acknowledge what she'd been feeling. She was falling in love with Colton Wade. The realization should have frightened her. After what had happened in Kansas, she'd sworn never to trust her heart to another man. Yet Colton was unlike anyone she'd ever known, strong without cruelty, kind without weakness, and respectful of her silence in a way that made her feel truly seen for perhaps the first time in her life. The snow fell harder outside, blanketing the ranch in white stillness. Tomorrow would bring chores and meals and the familiar rhythm of ranch life. But tonight, in the quiet aftermath of their shared task, Sadie felt something shift inside her, like ice breaking on a river after a long freeze, allowing life to flow once more. The following week brought the cattle buyer from Chicago, a blustery, important man named Harrington, who arrived with 2 assistants and expectations of being impressed. Sadie prepared a dinner that showcased the ranch's abundance: roast beef from Double Circle cattle, vegetables from the winter stores, and the cherry pie she'd saved the preserves for. Harrington praised the meal effusively, particularly the pie, which he declared the finest I've tasted west of the Mississippi. When Colton mentioned that Sadie was responsible for the cooking, the buyer turned to her with newfound respect. "You have quite a talent, Miss Armstrong," he said. "My compliments." Sadie nodded her thanks, aware of Colton watching her with quiet pride from the head of the table. Later, after contracts had been signed and Harrington and his men had retired to the guest rooms, Colton found Sadie in the kitchen. "That was perfect," he said. "Harrington's agreed to take twice as many head as last year, at a better price." He leaned against the door frame, his usual position when speaking with her in the kitchen. "We're hosting the Christmas gathering for the neighboring ranches next weekend. It's tradition my parents started it years ago." "Usually 20 or so people." Sadie's eyes widened slightly. "I know it's a lot," Colton acknowledged. "We can hire help from town if you'd prefer, or cancel altogether. The snow's making travel difficult anyway." Sadie shook her head firmly, then pointed to herself. "You want to handle it." Colton looked pleased but concerned. "It's a considerable undertaking." Sadie nodded decisively. She'd managed larger gatherings in her previous life before everything changed. This would be a welcome challenge, a chance to prove her worth beyond the daily meals and cleaning. "Very well," Colton said. "Make whatever preparations you need. Santiago can take the wagon into town for supplies tomorrow." He hesitated, then added, "There's a trunk in the attic with my mother's things, some dresses that is, if you wanted something festive for the gathering." He cleared his throat. "Just a thought." After he left, Sadie sat at the kitchen table, planning the menu in Mrs. Fletcher's notebook. A Christmas gathering meant she would face strangers again, people who would wonder about her silence. Yet strangely, the prospect didn't fill her with the usual dread. Here at Double Circle with Colton nearby, she felt secure enough to face such challenges. The next day, Santiago drove her to town for supplies. The foreman was respectful of her silence, occasionally pointing out landmarks or sharing ranch history as they traveled, but never pressing for response. Whiteridge looked different under its mantle of snow softer, the rough edges hidden beneath white. Still, Sadie kept her head down as they visited the general store, conscious of curious glances from townspeople who remembered the mute laundress. "Miss Armstrong," a familiar voice called as she was selecting spices. "What a pleasant surprise." Mrs. Holloway approached, beaming. "You're looking well. Ranch life must agree with you." Sadie smiled and nodded, genuinely pleased to see her former employer. "Mr. Wade treating you properly?" Mrs. Holloway asked, lowering her voice. "There's been talk in town, you know, a single woman out at that ranch." Santiago, overhearing as he approached with a crate of supplies, frowned. "Miss Armstrong is treated with nothing but respect at Double Circle, madam," he said firmly. "Mr. Wade sees to that personally." Mrs. Holloway had the grace to look embarrassed. "Of course, I didn't mean to imply otherwise. It's just that people talk." "People should mind their own business," Santiago replied evenly. "Miss Armstrong, is there anything else you need before we head back?" As they were loading the wagon, Sadie spotted Josiah Miller watching from across the street, his expression dark. She looked away quickly, but not before Santiago noticed. "Someone troubling you?" he asked quietly. Sadie shook her head, climbing onto the wagon seat. "Because if anyone is," Santiago continued, settling beside her, "the boss would want to know." The loyalty in his voice was unmistakable. These men didn't just work for Colton Wade, they believed in him. On the return journey, as the town fell away behind them, Sadie felt again that sense of leaving troubles behind. The ranch had become her sanctuary in ways she hadn't anticipated when accepting Colton's offer. The Christmas gathering preparations consumed the next few days. Sadie baked pies and cakes that could be stored, prepared sides that could be made ahead, and planned the roasting of 2 large turkeys that Santiago had hunted specially for the occasion. The evening before the gathering, after the men had retired, Sadie climbed the narrow stairs to the attic. She'd never been to the upper floors of the house, where Colton's quarters and office were located, and she moved quietly, conscious of intruding on his private space. The attic was surprisingly well organized, with trunks and furniture arranged neatly rather than haphazardly piled. A large trunk with E. Wade painted on its side stood against one wall, presumably containing the dresses Colton had mentioned. As Sadie knelt to open it, she heard a floorboard creak behind her. Turning, she found Colton standing in the attic doorway, a lamp in his hand. "I thought I heard someone up here," he said. "Found what you were looking for," Sadie nodded, gesturing to the trunk. "My mother's things," Colton confirmed, moving closer. "She was about your height, though perhaps a bit fuller in figure." He set the lamp on a nearby table, casting a warm glow over the attic. "May I?" When Sadie nodded, he knelt beside her and opened the trunk. Inside lay carefully folded dresses in rich fabric silks and velvets inappropriate for frontier life, but preserved nonetheless. "She saved these for special occasions," Colton said, lifting out a deep green velvet dress with lace trim. "Wore this one every Christmas until she fell ill." Sadie touched the fabric reverently. It was finer than anything she'd worn, even before her troubles began. "She'd want someone to use them," Colton said quietly. "They've been up here too long." Their eyes met over the open trunk, and something passed between them, an understanding that went beyond words. Colton was sharing not just clothing but memories, pieces of his past that he'd kept private until now. "Try them," he said, rising and stepping back. "Whatever fits, consider it yours." After he left, Sadie carefully lifted out the green dress. It was slightly old-fashioned but beautifully made, with a fitted bodice and full skirt. When she held it against herself, it seemed it might fit with minimal alterations. She took it and a simpler blue dress back to her room, where she spent the evening adjusting the green one for the gathering. As her needle moved through the rich fabric, Sadie allowed herself to imagine Colton's reaction when he saw her in his mother's dress, and found herself hoping it would please him. The day of the gathering dawned clear and cold, with fresh snow sparkling in the morning sun. Sadie was up before dawn, stoking the stove and beginning the preparations for a day of cooking. By noon, delicious aromas filled the house, and the dining table was extended to its full length, set with the ranch's best china and decorated with pine boughs and candles. The men had cleaned the barn for dancing later in the evening and strung lanterns from the rafters. Even Patch seemed to sense the occasion, staying uncharacteristically clean after Santiago gave him a bath. At 4 o'clock, with the turkeys roasting and everything else prepared, Sadie retreated to her room to dress. She'd had no time for such vanity in months, but today she washed her hair and pinned it up carefully, allowing a few soft curls to frame her face. The green dress fit well after her alterations, the rich color bringing out the gold flecks in her hazel eyes. When she emerged, the house was already filling with guests, neighboring ranchers and their families arriving by sleigh and wagon. Colton was at the door greeting them, handsome in a dark suit she'd never seen him wear before. He turned as she approached and for a moment simply stared. "Sadie," he said finally, his voice low, that dress was made for you." She smiled, a blush warming her cheeks. Colton offered his arm. "Let me introduce you to our guests." What followed was a whirlwind of introductions. Sadie nodded and smiled as Colton presented her to ranchers, their wives, and grown children. If anyone found her silence strange, they were too polite to mention it, following Colton's lead in addressing her directly despite her non-verbal responses. "Miss Armstrong is responsible for the feast we're about to enjoy," Colton told them as they gathered in the dining room. "And for making Double Circle feel like a home again." The meal was a triumph, everything cooked to perfection, and served with an efficiency that belied the number of guests. Sadie moved between kitchen and dining room, ensuring plates were filled and glasses replenished, aware of Colton's eyes following her with unmistakable admiration. After dinner, the gathering moved to the barn for music and dancing. Santiago's eldest son played fiddle, while Jackson Harper proved surprisingly skilled with a concertina. The festive atmosphere grew as neighbors who rarely saw each other through the winter months caught up on news and family happenings. Sadie stood at the edge of the gathering, watching the dancers with quiet enjoyment. She'd done her part with the meal, now she could observe the results of their collective efforts, a community coming together in celebration. "May I have this dance?" Colton appeared beside her, hand extended. Sadie hesitated, surprised by the invitation. "Unless you'd rather not," he added quickly. She shook her head and placed her hand in his. As he led her onto the cleared barn floor, the musicians began a waltz. Colton's hand settled at her waist, firm but respectful, while the other clasped hers. "I should warn you," he said as they began to move, "I'm better with cattle than dancing." But his steps were sure as he guided her through the waltz. Sadie followed easily, aware of curious glances from others but focused on the warmth of Colton's hand at her waist, the clean scent of his shaving soap, and the way his eyes never left her face. "I've wanted to do this since you arrived," Colton admitted quietly. "Dance with you, I mean." Sadie's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Is that so hard to believe?" he asked, a smile tugging at his lips. "You must know how remarkable you are, Sadie." She shook her head slightly, not in denial but in wonder at his words. "You came here alone, made a place for yourself without speaking a word, won over a bunch of rough cowboys, and transformed this house back into a home." His voice dropped lower. "And you look at me sometimes in a way that makes me think. That makes me hope I'm not imagining things between us." The music swelled around them, but Sadie barely heard it. Her world had narrowed to Colton's face, his words, and the emotions they stirred within her. Slowly, deliberately, she squeezed his hand and nodded once. Relief and joy spread across his features. "I know there are things in your past you haven't shared," he said. "Things that may be why you don't speak. I don't need to know them unless someday you want to tell me. What matters is now and how I feel when I'm with you." As the waltz ended, Colton kept hold of her hand. "Would you walk with me a moment? It's a bit crowded in here." Outside, the night was crystal clear, stars blazing in a black sky above the snow-covered ranch. Their breath formed clouds in the cold air as Colton led her to the porch, where a lantern cast a pool of golden light. "I've never been a man of many words," Colton said, facing her. "So maybe it's fitting that I've fallen in love with a woman who uses none at all." Sadie's heart stuttered at the declaration. "I love you, Sadie Armstrong," he continued, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the words. "I think I began falling the day I defended you in town, and every day since has only deepened those feelings. I love your strength, your kindness, the way you communicate without words, the peace you've brought to this place." He took both her hands in his. "I'm not asking for promises now. Just the chance to court you properly, to show you what a life together might be." Tears filled Sadie's eyes, not of sadness but overwhelming emotion. For so long, she'd believed her silence would isolate her forever, that no man would want a woman who couldn't or wouldn't speak. Yet here stood Colton Wade, offering his heart without conditions. Pulling one hand free, she reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the strong line of his jaw. Then, standing on tiptoe, she pressed her lips to his in answer. The kiss was gentle at first, a meeting of souls more than bodies. Then Colton's arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer as the kiss deepened. When they finally parted, both breathless despite the cold, he rested his forehead against hers. "I'll take that as a yes," he whispered. Sadie smiled and nodded, her heart too full for any other response, even if she could have spoken. From the barn came the sounds of music and laughter, the Christmas gathering continuing in full swing. But on the porch, in their private world of lamplight and newfound declarations, Sadie and Colton lingered, reluctant to break the spell of the moment. Finally, Colton offered his arm. "Shall we rejoin our guests? I believe I'm entitled to another dance with the most beautiful woman at the gathering." As they walked back to the barn, Sadie felt lighter than she had in years, as if the weight of her past had somehow lessened in the face of this unexpected future opening before her. Christmas Day dawned with fresh snow and a sense of quiet joy throughout the ranch. The men exchanged simple gifts in the kitchen: hand-carved pipes, new gloves, books for the long winter evenings. Sadie had baked special treats for each of them, which were received with touching appreciation. Colton's gift to her was a delicate silver pendant on a chain, a small star that caught the light when she moved. "To remind you that even the darkest night has stars," he said, as he fastened it around her neck, his fingers lingering against her skin. Her gift to him was a hand-knitted scarf in deep blue wool, worked on secretly during the evening hours after the kitchen was closed. When he wrapped it around his neck immediately, declaring it the finest he'd ever owned, Sadie felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the crackling fire. The days between Christmas and New Year passed in a pleasant blur. Colton began courting her openly, joining her in the kitchen in the evenings to talk about his day while she prepared the next morning's bread, or inviting her to ride with him to check the nearby pastures. The men observed this development with knowing smiles but respectful distance. On New Year's Eve, with the ranch quiet under a blanket of fresh snow, Colton invited Sadie to his office after supper. It was the first time she'd been in his private space, a comfortable room lined with bookshelves and dominated by a large desk covered with ranch ledgers. "I thought we might welcome the new year together," he said, gesturing to 2 glasses and a bottle of good whiskey on a side table. "If you'd like." Sadie nodded, settling into the offered chair beside the fireplace. Colton poured a small measure of whiskey into each glass, handing one to her before taking the seat opposite. "To new beginnings," he said, raising his glass. They sipped in companionable silence for a few minutes, the fire crackling and snow falling gently outside the window. Then Colton set his glass aside and leaned forward. "Sadie, there's something I've been wanting to ask," he began. And if it's too soon or if you're not ready, I understand completely." She tilted her head questioningly. "Would you consider making your position here permanent, not as housekeeper, but as—" He took a breath. "As my wife." Sadie's eyes widened. Despite their growing closeness, she hadn't expected a proposal so soon. "I know it's sudden," Colton continued quickly. "And I know there may be reasons you're hesitant. Your silence, your past, whatever it holds. But I love you, Sadie. I want to build a life with you right here at Double Circle." He reached for her hand. "You don't have to answer now. Take all the time you need. Just know that my feelings won't change whether you speak 1,000 words or none at all." Sadie set her glass down carefully, her mind racing. Did she love Colton? Unquestionably, did she trust him? With her safety, her well-being, her happiness, yes. But with her darkest secrets. With the truth of why she'd stopped speaking, she'd carried her silence like armor for so long. It had protected her, but also isolated her. Now Colton offered a future where her silence was accepted without condition, yet a marriage built on unspoken truths seemed a shaky foundation. Rising from her chair, Sadie moved to the window, watching snow swirl in the lamplight outside. Behind her, she heard Colton remain seated, giving her the space to think. Finally, she turned and crossed to his desk. Finding a sheet of paper and a pencil, she began to write. The scratching of the pencil was the only sound in the room as Colton watched, his expression a mixture of curiosity and concern. When she finished, Sadie handed him the paper, then stepped back, her heart pounding as he began to read. "My name is Sadie Armstrong. I was married once before in Kansas to a man named William Tate. He was charming when we courted, but changed after the wedding. His temper grew violent. When I threatened to leave, he beat me so badly I lost our unborn child. While I recovered, he spread rumors that I was unstable, that I had harmed myself. No one believed me when I tried to tell the truth. The day I finally escaped, he caught me at the stagecoach station. In the struggle, his gun discharged, killing him. It was ruled self-defense, but his brother, the town marshal, swore vengeance. I fled west, and somewhere between Kansas and Montana, I stopped speaking. Words had failed me so completely they hadn't saved me from William, hadn't convinced anyone of the truth, hadn't protected our child. Silence felt safer. It still does most days. But I love you, Colton Wade, and if you still want me after knowing this, my answer is yes." When Colton looked up from the paper, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Sadie," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Thank you for trusting me with this." He stood and crossed to her, taking her hands in his. "Nothing in this changes how I feel about you. If anything, I love you more for your strength, for surviving, for finding your way here." He touched her face gently. "And yes, I still want you to be my wife, with all my heart." Sadie felt something shift inside her, not a sudden desire to speak, but a loosening of the knot that had kept her silent for so long. Perhaps someday words would come again, perhaps not. But for the first time, she believed either way would be acceptable. She leaned into Colton's embrace as the mantel clock began to strike midnight, ushering in a new year and a new beginning. They were married on a clear February morning, with Judge Patterson riding out from Whiteridge to perform the ceremony in the ranch house sitting room. Santiago stood as Colton's best man, while Mrs. Holloway, invited specially for the occasion, attended Sadie. Word had spread throughout the county about the silent woman who had captured Colton Wade's heart. Some, like Josiah Miller, still whispered unkind speculations. But most were simply curious about the unusual match, the prosperous rancher and the mysterious woman who never spoke. For the ceremony, Sadie wore the blue dress from Alina Wade's trunk, altered to fit her perfectly. She carried a bouquet of pine branches and dried flowers that Santiago's wife had arranged. When Judge Patterson asked if she took Colton as her husband, she nodded firmly and squeezed Colton's hand. "I've never performed a wedding quite like this," the judge commented afterward during the small reception. "But I've rarely seen a couple so well matched. Sometimes words are overrated." That evening, after the guests had departed and the ranch had settled into quiet, Colton led his bride upstairs to the master bedroom, now their shared space. He'd had the room redecorated, with new curtains and bedding in soft blues that Sadie had once mentioned she favored. "Welcome home, Mrs. Wade," he said softly, closing the door behind them. In the privacy of their room, as winter stars shone through the window, they became truly husband and wife. Colton was gentle and patient, mindful of Sadie's past, letting her set the pace of their intimacy. For her part, Sadie found that her body remembered joy it had forgotten, responding to Colton's touch with an openness that surprised and delighted them both. Afterward, lying in the circle of his arms, Sadie felt a peace she'd thought forever lost. Here was safety. Here was acceptance. Here, perhaps, was the possibility of healing. Spring came to double circle with the usual flurry of activity: calving season, fence repairs after winter damage, preparation of fields for planting. Sadie settled into her role as the rancher's wife with natural grace. She still managed the household, but now with the authority of partnership rather than employment. The men continued to treat her with respect, though the relationship had shifted subtly. She was now the boss's wife, the lady of the ranch, and they looked to her not just for meals but for the small comforts that made the hard work bearable: special treats on birthdays, mended shirts returned with extra buttons sewn on, medical attention for minor injuries. Santiago's wife, Maria, became a frequent visitor and friend. Though Sadie still didn't speak, the two women developed their own means of communication, with Sadie occasionally writing notes when gestures wouldn't suffice. "She understands you," Maria told Colton one afternoon as they watched Sadie in the garden. "Not just what you're trying to say, but who you are inside. That's rare, with or without words." Colton couldn't disagree. His marriage, though unconventional, had brought him a contentment he'd never expected to find. Each day revealed new aspects of Sadie's character: her quick intelligence, her dry sense of humor that showed in her expressive eyes, her unwavering support of his work and decisions. In late April, Colton needed to travel to Helena for a cattlemen's association meeting, his first time away from the ranch since their marriage. The night before his departure, as they lay together in the darkness, he felt Sadie's tension in the way she held herself against him. "I'll only be gone a week," he assured her, stroking her hair. "Santiago will keep things running smoothly here." Sadie nodded against his chest, but her grip on him tightened slightly. "Are you worried about being alone?" he asked gently. She shook her head, then hesitated, reaching for the pad and pencil they kept beside the bed for when she needed to communicate more complex thoughts. "What if William's brother has been searching for me?" she wrote. "What if he comes here while you're gone?" Colton read the note in the dim lamplight, then set it aside, turning to face her fully. "First, the chances of him finding you after all this time are incredibly small. Second, you're not Sadie Armstrong anymore, you're Sadie Wade, my wife, and this entire ranch would stand between you and anyone who wished you harm." He kissed her forehead. "But to ease your mind, I'll speak with Santiago before I leave. He'll keep a special watch, though he doesn't need to know the details." The reassurance seemed to help. The next morning, Sadie stood on the porch, waving as Colton rode away. If her smile didn't quite reach her eyes, he pretended not to notice, not wanting to deepen her concerns. The week passed uneventfully at Double Circle. Sadie kept busy with spring cleaning and garden planting, while the men focused on the new calves and preparing for the summer grazing. Santiago checked in regularly as promised, though there was no sign of trouble. On the 6th day, a rider approached from town, not Colton, who wasn't expected until the following day, but Sheriff Burke from Whiteridge. Sadie watched from the kitchen window as Santiago met him in the yard, their conversation appearing serious. When Santiago glanced toward the house, Sadie felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. Moments later, a knock came at the kitchen door. "Mrs. Wade," Santiago called. "Sheriff Burke would like to speak with you." Wiping her hands on her apron, Sadie opened the door. Sheriff Burke removed his hat, his weathered face grave. "Mrs. Wade, I'm afraid there's been an incident in Helena involving your husband." Sadie clutched the doorframe, her knuckles whitening. "He's alive," the sheriff added quickly, seeing her distress. "But he's been shot." Apparently he interrupted a robbery at his hotel. "The doctor in Helena patched him up, but he's asking for you. Santiago says he can take you there immediately." Relief and fear warred within Sadie as she nodded. Colton was alive but injured, far from home, needing her. Within 20 minutes, she had packed a small bag and was in the wagon with Santiago, headed for the train station in Whiteridge. "He'll be all right, Mrs. Wade," Santiago said as they traveled. "The boss is too stubborn to let a bullet stop him." The journey to Helena took nearly a full day, first by wagon to Whiteridge, then by train to the territorial capital. Every mile felt endless to Sadie, her mind conjuring increasingly dire scenarios despite the sheriff's assurance that Colton's wound wasn't life-threatening. Helena in 1876 was a bustling city by frontier standards, with proper streets and substantial buildings replacing the rough mining camp it had been a decade earlier. The Grand Hotel, where Colton had been staying, was among the finest establishments in the territory. When Sadie arrived, escorted by Santiago, the hotel manager met them in the lobby. "Mrs. Wade, your husband has been asking for you. The doctor saw him this morning and says he's improving, though he needs rest." He led them upstairs to a large corner room. Colton lay in the bed, his face pale against the white pillows, his left shoulder heavily bandaged. But his eyes were clear, and the smile that broke across his face when he saw Sadie erased some of the fear that had gripped her heart. "There you are," he said, extending his right hand to her. "I told them you'd come." Sadie rushed to him, taking his hand and pressing it to her cheek, tears of relief spilling onto his fingers. "It looks worse than it is," Colton assured her. "The bullet went clean through the shoulder, no bones broken, though I'll be useless with a rope for a while." Santiago stepped forward. "What happened, boss?" Colton's expression darkened. "Wrong place, wrong time. I was coming back to my room when I interrupted two men robbing the room across the hall. One of them panicked and fired." He looked back at Sadie. "The sheriff caught them trying to leave town." "They're in custody now. When can you travel?" Santiago asked. "Doctor says 2 more days to be safe." Colton squeezed Sadie's hand. "I'm sorry to frighten you like this." She shook her head, touching his face gently. What mattered was that he was alive, healing, and would return home with her. Santiago cleared his throat. "I'll get a room and stay until you're ready to travel, boss. Mrs. Wade can stay here with you." After he left, Sadie helped Colton drink some water, then settled beside him on the bed, careful not to disturb his injured shoulder. "Some honeymoon, huh?" Colton said wryly. "Next time, I promise somewhere more romantic than a Helena hotel room with a bullet wound." Sadie smiled despite her worry, leaning down to kiss him softly. That night, as Colton slept, Sadie stood by the window looking out at the city lights. The events of the day had shaken her deeply, not just Colton's injury, but the stark reminder of how precious and precarious life could be. In the space of hours, her world had nearly shattered. She thought about William, about the fear that had kept her silent for so long. She thought about Colton, about his acceptance and love that asked nothing in return. And she thought about the future, their future, and what it might hold. When Colton stirred and called softly for water, Sadie returned to his bedside. As she helped him drink, their eyes met in the dim lamplight. "Thank you," he said, "for coming, for being here." Sadie set the glass down and took a deep breath. "Always," she whispered, her voice rough from disuse but unmistakable in the quiet room. Colton's eyes widened. "Sadie, I love you," she said, the words feeling strange but right on her tongue. "I thought I might lose you without ever saying it." Tears filled Colton's eyes as he reached for her. "Say it again," he requested softly. "I love you, Colton Wade," Sadie repeated, her voice growing stronger. "With all my heart." He pulled her down into a gentle embrace, mindful of his injury. "Your voice is even more beautiful than I imagined." "It might be a while before I'm comfortable speaking to others," Sadie warned. This is just for you for now." "That's more than enough," Colton assured her. "Every word is a gift I never expected." They returned to Double Circle 3 days later, Colton still weak but improving daily. Santiago had ridden ahead to prepare the men, so when they arrived, everything was ready, the house clean, a hot meal waiting, and the ranch hands conspicuously busy elsewhere to give the couple privacy. That evening, after Sadie had changed Colton's bandages and helped him to bed, she sat beside him, holding his hand. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice gaining confidence with each word spoken. "About the future, about us." Colton squeezed her hand encouragingly. "What about us?" "I want to start fresh," Sadie said. "Completely. I want to tell the sheriff about William, about Kansas, not because I'm afraid anymore, but because I don't want that shadow hanging over us." Colton considered this. "Are you sure? It was self-defense, Sadie. You've done nothing wrong." "I know that now," she said. "But as long as it's a secret, it has power over me. I want to be free of it, free to be your wife without fear." "Then we'll speak to Sheriff Burke when I'm back on my feet," Colton promised. Together. 2 weeks later, they did just that. In the sheriff's office in Whiteridge, Sadie told her story from beginning to end, her voice sometimes faltering but never failing. Sheriff Burke listened without interruption, taking notes occasionally. When she finished, he sat back in his chair. "That's quite a tale, Mrs. Wade. And a heavy burden to carry alone all this time." "She's not alone anymore," Colton said, his hand firm on Sadie's shoulder. Sheriff Burke nodded. "I'll wire the authorities in Kansas, confirm your account. But given the circumstances and the time that's passed, I don't anticipate any legal repercussions here." He looked at Sadie directly. "As for William's brother, if he ever shows his face in my jurisdiction causing trouble, he'll answer to me, and I suspect half of Double Circle Ranch as well." As they left the sheriff's office, Sadie felt lighter than she had in years. The secret was out, the words spoken, and the world hadn't ended. In fact, it felt as though it was just beginning. They walked down Whiteridge's Main Street, past the spot where they had first met, where Colton had defended her silence before he knew anything about her. People nodded to them respectfully, Colton being one of the most prominent ranchers in the county, and his wife now a subject of curious but no longer malicious interest. As they passed Jennings' General Store, Josiah Miller emerged, stopping short when he saw them. His gaze lingered on Sadie, and for a moment it seemed he might make some comment. But something in Colton's stance must have dissuaded him, for he merely touched his hat and continued on his way. "He still thinks I can't speak," Sadie observed quietly when Josiah was out of earshot. "Let him think what he wants," Colton replied. "Your words are too precious to waste on the likes of him." Sadie smiled, slipping her arm through Colton's. "I'm saving them for people who matter." By summer, life at Double Circle had found a new rhythm. Sadie spoke freely with Colton in private, her voice growing stronger and more confident with each passing day. With the ranch hands, she remained mostly silent, though occasionally she would speak a word or two when necessary, causing initial surprise but increasing acceptance as the men adjusted to this new development. Santiago was the first she had a full conversation with, thanking him properly for his help during Colton's injury. The foreman had accepted the change with characteristic dignity. "Words or no words, you're still the same person, Mrs. Wade, and a fine one at that." In July, Sadie confirmed what she'd suspected for several weeks: she was expecting a child. When she told Colton, his joy was tempered with concern, knowing her history. "We'll take every precaution," he promised. "The best doctor, complete rest if needed." "This time will be different," Sadie assured him, placing his hand on her still flat stomach. "This time, everything is different." As her pregnancy progressed, Sadie began to venture more regularly into town, sometimes accompanying Colton on business, sometimes going alone to select fabrics for baby clothes or to visit Mrs. Holloway. Each trip became easier as she gradually began speaking to more people, first Mrs. Holloway, then Mr. Jennings at the store, then others. The reactions varied. Some were startled, having become accustomed to her silence. Others seemed almost disappointed, as if her mystery had been more interesting than her reality. But most were simply accepting, incorporating this new fact about the rancher's wife into their understanding without much fuss. Josiah Miller remained an exception. One afternoon in September, when Sadie was selecting yarn at the general store, he approached her as she stood alone by the counter. "So you can talk after all," he said, his tone somewhere between accusation and curiosity. Was it all an act then, some kind of game? Sadie considered ignoring him, retreating into the silence that had protected her for so long. But she was tired of hiding, tired of fear. "No game, mister." "Miller," she said quietly but clearly. Just a woman who had learned that sometimes silence is safer than speech. Josiah blinked, clearly surprised she had actually responded. "And now I've learned that speech has its place too," she said. "Especially when standing up to bullies." Color rose in Josiah's face. "I never you did," Sadie interrupted, "and perhaps still would given the chance. But I'm not the same woman you surrounded in the street that day. I'm Sadie Wade now." The pride with which she said her married name wasn't lost on Josiah. He stepped back slightly. "Wade's a fortunate man." "We both are," Sadie corrected him. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have purchases to complete." It was a small confrontation, but as Sadie left the store with her parcels, she felt a sense of triumph. She had faced one of her tormentors and emerged stronger not through silence this time, but through carefully chosen words. The first snow of winter fell in early November, turning Double Circle into a wonderland of white. Sadie, now visibly pregnant, stood at the window of the sitting room watching the flakes swirl down from a pewter sky. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Colton said, coming to stand behind her, his arms encircling her expanded waistline. "It reminds me of last year," Sadie said, leaning back against him. "When everything changed. For the better, I hope," Colton murmured, kissing the top of her head. "Beyond anything I could have imagined." She turned in his arms to face him. "Do you remember what you said that first day, when Josiah and the others were mocking me?" Colton smiled. "That your silence spoke louder than any of them." "It did," Sadie agreed. "It spoke of pain and fear and survival, but now—" She placed his hand on her rounded belly where their child grew strong and healthy. "Now I want my voice to speak of love and hope and future." "It already does," Colton assured her. "Every day in 1,000 ways." Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the ranch in pristine white. Inside, the fire crackled warmly, casting a golden glow over the room where Sadie and Colton stood embraced, two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed. He, a woman whose silence had revealed her strength. She, a man who had heard what wasn't spoken and loved her anyway. Their story, like the ranch itself, was still unfolding, a chapter closing, a new one beginning. But whatever words or silences the future held, they would face them together at Double Circle Ranch, where a love born in silence now spoke loudly enough for all to hear. On a crisp spring morning in 1877, Charlotte Eleanor Wade was born in the master bedroom of Double Circle Ranch, announced to the world with a lusty cry that made her parents laugh through their tears of joy. She had Colton's blue eyes and Sadie's delicate features, a perfect blend of them both. "She certainly doesn't take after her mother in quietness," Colton joked as he held his daughter for the first time. "Thank goodness for that," Sadie replied, exhausted but radiant. "I want her voice to be heard from the beginning." As word spread of the new arrival, the ranch became a place of celebration. The hands hung a wooden star over the main gate, a Double Circle tradition to announce a birth, and Santiago's wife arrived with meals and practical help for the new parents. Even Whiteridge joined in the festivities. Mrs. Holloway organized a gift collection from the townswomen, and Sheriff Burke brought a hand-carved wooden cradle, a hobby of mine. He explained gruffly when Colton expressed surprise at the beautiful workmanship. In the quiet moments between visitors, when it was just the three of them, Sadie would often find Colton watching her and Charlotte with an expression of wonder. "What are you thinking?" she asked one evening as she nursed the baby in the rocking chair beside their bed. That I'm the luckiest man in Montana territory, he replied. That I have everything I never knew I wanted. He knelt beside the chair, touching Charlotte's tiny hand, and that I can't wait to see what she becomes. Something extraordinary, Sadie predicted, looking down at their daughter's peaceful face. With your courage and determination. And your strength, Colton added. The strength it took to survive, to start again, to find your voice. As Charlotte grew from infant to toddler, it became clear she had indeed inherited qualities from both parents. She had Colton's fearlessness, climbing onto her first pony before she could properly walk, and Sadie's thoughtfulness, often observing intently before acting. And she had a voice sweet and clear and unafraid. By age 3, she was chattering to the ranch hands, singing to the chickens, and telling elaborate stories to Patch, now elderly but still devoted to his small mistress. "Mama, tell me again about your silence," she requested one night as Sadie tucked her into bed. It had become a favorite bedtime story, carefully edited for young ears. "Once upon a time," Sadie began, smoothing Charlotte's dark curls, "a young woman lost her words. They weren't stolen, they just hid themselves away, deep inside her heart where they felt safe. Because she was sad," Charlotte supplied. "Yes, very sad," Sadie confirmed, "and a little afraid, so she traveled far away looking for a place where she could be safe even without her words. And then she came to Double Circle and met Papa, that's right, and Papa didn't mind that she had no words. He listened to her silence and understood it anyway. And then they fell in love," Charlotte said dreamily. "We did," Sadie agreed. "And because of that love, and because Papa made her feel safe, the woman's words started to come back, first just a few, then more and more. And now you talk all the time," Charlotte concluded with a giggle. "Not all the time," Sadie corrected with a smile. "Sometimes silence is still a choice, a peaceful one, not a fearful one." As Charlotte drifted to sleep, Sadie returned downstairs to find Colton in his office, reviewing the ranch ledgers. He looked up as she entered, his face softening in the way it always did when he saw her. "She asleep?" he asked, finally. She wanted the silent story again. Colton smiled. "She loves that one, probably because it has a happy ending." "The happiest," Sadie agreed, moving behind his chair to massage his shoulders, "though sometimes I think the story is still being written." 5 years into their marriage, Double Circle was thriving. The cattle operation had expanded, they'd added sheep on the northern pastures at Sadie's suggestion, and the ranch's reputation for quality stock had spread throughout the territory and beyond. Their family had grown as well. 2 years after Charlotte, they'd welcomed Samuel Colton Wade, a sturdy, serious boy with his mother's hazel eyes and his father's steady nature. Now, as spring blossomed across the ranch, Sadie carried their third child, due in early summer. Life wasn't without challenges. Drought had threatened the previous year, and the changing politics of the territory occasionally brought conflicts with neighboring ranches over water rights and grazing areas. But through it all, Sadie and Colton faced each challenge as they had from the beginning together, with a strength forged in the unlikely bond between a silent woman and the man who had heard her heart. One summer evening, as they sat on the porch watching Charlotte and Samuel playing with the new litter of puppies Patch had sired before his passing, Colton took Sadie's hand. "You ever think about that day in town?" he asked. "When we first met, often," Sadie admitted. "It was the turning point, wasn't it, when everything changed?" "For both of us," Colton agreed. "I went to town for supplies and came home with a purpose." Sadie laughed softly. "Is that what I was, a purpose?" "The best kind," Colton said, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "You reminded me that actions matter more than words, that listening is as important as speaking, that sometimes the strongest people are the quietest. And you taught me that silence can be a choice, not a prison," Sadie replied. "That I could be heard without speaking, but also that when I was ready, my voice would be welcomed." From the yard came the sound of children's laughter as Samuel toppled backward, swarmed by enthusiastic puppies. Charlotte's voice rose in delighted instruction. "No, Sammy." You have to let them smell your hand first, like Mama showed us. She's so much like you, Colton observed, full of quiet wisdom. But never afraid to speak it, Sadie added with a smile. That's your influence. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the ranch in gold and amber, Sadie leaned against her husband's shoulder, content in the life they had built. From silence had come understanding. From understanding, love. From love, a family and future neither could have imagined when they first met on that dusty street in Whiteridge. Her silence speaks louder than any of you, Colton had said that day, defending a woman he didn't know. How right he had been, and how much louder still spoke the love that had grown from that silence, echoing now in their children's laughter, in the prosperous ranch around them, and in the countless days and nights of shared joy and hardship that had forged their unbreakable bond. In the gathering dusk, with their children playing before them and their third child growing within her, Sadie turned to kiss her husband, a silent communication more eloquent than any words could be. Some things, after all, were still best expressed in silence.